The mouthpiece we're looking at today here is easily the most expensive that I've ever discussed or demoed on this channel. It belongs to a friend of mine in the Spokane British Brass Band, where I have been playing for a few seasons now, and he paid a lot of money for it, and since then it has basically made, as my old trumpet teacher would say, a very nice paperweight. So back in my first season, after we talked about mouthpieces for a little while, he mentioned having this mouthpiece and mentioned that he wasn't using it and allowed me to try it, and perhaps had a little bit of a vested interest in me wanting to buy it off of him. Spoiler alert, I did not do that, but nonetheless, it was an interesting sort of experiment, so today we are finally, after 2.5 years of this footage sitting around and not getting used, going to talk about it. Let's get started. I've tested a couple of Monette mouthpieces very sporadically over the years, but never comprehensively or extensively enough or for a long enough period of time to fully acclimate to it and fully realize the benefits of the Monette school of design. So apologies if this is going to be a little bit lackluster. This is my first time talking about a real boutique mouthpiece on the channel, and the amount of work that I put into this was a couple of practice sessions, and the second one was where I recorded these demos, and that was forever ago, so I'm going off of old notes that I wrote down at that time. But nonetheless, hope you'll forgive me. I wanted to talk about this mouthpiece on the channel, so we're going to give it our best shot. What we're looking at today is not just any Monette mouthpiece. This is a Monette Prana Model B4SFL R6. That's a lot of letters and numbers. I really had no idea what any of that meant, and there wasn't an exact answer on the Monette mouthpiece chart as to what that exact model meant. So the first thing I did once I got this mouthpiece and tried to ID it was I took to Facebook and asked the trumpet cornet gurus over there for help. Daniel writes, the original B4S was modeled after the late Lou Solliff's vintage New York Bach 3C. Makes sense, the New York and Mount Vernon Bach 3Cs are highly coveted. It is comparable in size, diameter, to a modern 1.5C, but with the contour of that vintage piece. That's a big change from the modern 1.5C. The FL R6 designation is an updated version of Monette's Deep V turn-of-the-century cornet cup. Turn-of-the-century cornet specifically typically refers to sort of late 1800s to 1900s, and that's the era in which we often think of a traditional cornet tone where it was thin, fluffy, sort of dark and woofy, the type of sound that I personally like to produce, just with a little bit less breadth to the sound than I like to have. The R stands for the late Ron Miles, for whom this updated cup shape was designed, and Daniel mentions there were at least 5 versions, likely many more, before the final R6 was chosen as the best. It is now the standard, although custom, deep V cornet mouthpiece shape that Monette makes. And then of course a big question about Monette mouthpieces in general is throat size, since they typically run on the much larger side of the scale. Daniel says throat and other info depends on whether this was made for a Monette instrument or for conventional cornets. In this case, since we don't see an integral screw system, it's not specifically designed for a Monette cornet. It can be used on any cornet. Supposedly the one designed for his Monette cornet is an 8 drill size, which is huge. So I'd imagine that this thing probably has around a 14 or a 15 drill. Unfortunately, I don't even have a throat check tool now. I really need to get one. I certainly didn't have one 2.5 years ago, so no way of knowing for sure. As far as my personal taste in brass band cornet mouthpieces, it's pretty straightforward. I started getting into brass band cornet playing, although I wasn't in Spokane British Brass Band at the time, back in high school on a Dennis Wick 2, which was fun to play and I loved the sound, but it was pretty inefficient for long sessions, and so I ended up getting a Yamaha 16E that I found to be more efficient and ended up preferring in the end. Back at the time of demoing this Monette back in mid-22, that was the mouthpiece I was using for essentially all of my cornet playing. I was basically not playing on any other cornet mouthpieces at the time. And then later I would transition to a Dennis Wick 2B that I ended up liking a lot, even more so than the Yamaha. But those mouthpieces are all pretty similar in that they share an inner diameter that is very close to the modern Bach 1.5C. That's just my optimum. And they're all pretty deep, although to varying extents. Out of those, the Monette was most similar to the 16E. It felt like fairly familiar territory, and in fact that played a big role in me not wanting to spend the dough on it. It just felt too similar to my 16E with too little further benefit beyond what the 16E provided me at the time. And frankly, I think that I like the 2B more than either the Monette or the 16E, so I'm happy with where I've ended up. But nonetheless, we'll take a look at some of these other pictures that I took of the Monette and examine some of the differences there. We'll note that because this was based on a New York era Bach piece, as in between the 1920s and the 1940s, the rim on it is quite flat, and that tracks. Generally speaking, it's not that the entire trumpet community has gravitated towards playing on rounder rims over time, but more and more makers have made rounder and rounder rims available since, that New York era of 20s to 40s. Definitely since then, manufacturing techniques have evolved a lot. There are just differences in mouthpiece design now compared to mouthpieces back then, and it's much easier to acquire a rim that isn't just totally sanded flat in a way. There are still plenty of players who prefer to play on flat rims because they like the way it kind of melts to their face, but I really don't like that. If I'm playing on a flat rim, it better be something like the Yamaha 16E that has a little bit of inward concavity to it so it doesn't have a sharp inner edge to it. And if it doesn't have a concavity to it, I really like it to be rounder so that I'm not feeling the inner edge and so that the high point is a little bit further out on the rim, which has the effect of making the inner diameter feel a little bit roomier than it actually is. And so the mouthpiece maybe plays bigger without actually demanding more effort. And I have to say, that is a very flat rim. I don't play on rims that flat, and I didn't have the words to articulate it at the time of when I tried this, so I just noted that I didn't like the feel of the rim, but that flatness is very much why, and the influence of the New York Bach 3C specifically, as opposed to the modern Bach 3C, definitely is a big factor in the way this mouthpiece was designed. We'll also look at the cup there. It's, again, pretty similar to that of the 16E, where it is really deep like the Dennis Wick 2, but on the other hand, it has that more efficient shape where it is pretty much a V cup all the way down. That was the case for a lot of those turn-of-the-century cornet mouthpieces, as Daniel mentioned. The more U-shaped deep cup is more of a recent development. Not incredibly recent, but we're talking later than the early 1900s. It's less efficient, but grants you a little bit more breadth to the sound. When I took this mouthpiece to the practice room to demo it, I recorded a few brass band and solo excerpts that I'd worked on recently, and I noted some observations in a Word document of things that I felt the Monette did well for me and not so well for me. And looking at these observations now, they're very dichotomously split. I think there is one spec that is responsible for a lot of the things I do like, and there is one more obvious spec that was responsible for a lot of things I didn't like, although I didn't fully realize it at the time. This is very interesting. Let's discuss. Something I really liked about the Monette was the fact that despite having a dark core and a nice center to the sound, it still had good clarity and projection and felt like you still had sort of a cone of sound going forward. It wasn't all just kind of trickling around you. That's sometimes what you get with inefficiently designed cornet mouthpieces. They tend to kind of fuzz out a little bit and not project super well. I liked the clarity of the Monette. Moreover, the pitch of it was a little bit truer than some inefficient cornet mouthpieces. I mentioned the Dennis Wick 2 being a little bit inefficient. I of course don't want to denigrate the mouthpiece too much, but the Dennis Wick 2, whether for reasons concerning my chops or the way it was designed, never quite stayed true in the upper register. It would go increasingly flatter as you ascended above the staff. It would just get more and more tiring to bring that pitch up. The Monette eliminates pretty much all of that. It is truly up to pitch. Now, the Yamaha 16E was also pretty well up to pitch, but I think the Monette just took it a little bit farther and just a little bit more locked in. And overall, it felt balanced up there. All of this, I think, is influenced by Dave Monette's school of throat design specifically. The throat of the mouthpiece being so large is a double-edged sword. It's a little bit scary to play on such a large throat because that's the biggest regulator of the amount of air you're putting into the trumpet, since that's by far the point of greatest resistance on the apparatus, not counting your physicality, just counting the mouthpiece and instrument. And so when you play on such a big throat, the immediate realization is, wow, I have to use a lot of air to kind of keep the pitch going and keep it stable and keep it full on this thing. But on the other hand, a larger throat and backbore geometry can do a few things, including keep the pitch up a little bit better in the upper register, allow for a little bit easier pitch bending that takes a little bit less muscling from the embouchure or from the airstream. And moreover, if you can ride that lack of resistance and use your air in the right way, it can improve your clarity and projection. The other thing I noted in my Word doc as a strength of the Monette was its ability to change tone qualities quickly. This is Again, something that I flip-flop about a little bit on cornet. On trumpet, I like to be able to change tone qualities from really bright to really dark. On flugelhorn, I like to sound dark no matter what I'm doing. Cornet's a little bit of a different ballgame. I think there are merits to being able to play a little bit brighter. I prefer to stay dark for most of my dynamic range, if I can help it. But all of this might be slightly moot, because the Bach 184G that I was testing this Monette on is just a bipolar instrument. It can sound really dark and cornetty at the soft dynamics, but as soon as you hit forte, it pretty much becomes a trumpet. That's a topic we'll unpack a little bit further once I actually review that instrument. That's not what this video is for, but it's something I've noticed over the years with the 184. Now, the first con that I wrote down was that I found this mouthpiece tiring to play. I think that's a couple things. First of all, that is essentially the other end of the double-edged sword that is a large throat. There is a point for every player at which it is just overdoing it to expand the throat any further, and I unfortunately don't know where that point is for me. I thought I would be pretty good at playing on large throats considering my background on things like the Dennis Wick 2 and 2B, but then again, I don't know what the throat is on this mouthpiece exactly anyway, so I can't really tell either side of the equation. But there is another reason I think it was tiring me out, and it kind of bundles nicely with the next couple of cons that I put down. First things first, I noted that I would have expected it to sound a little bit darker given the enormity and depth of the mouthpiece, and moreover, I would have expected more power and ease of play in the lower register. I found it to be pretty fuzzy, again, considering that massive depth and throat size, and an inner diameter that generally should work really well for me. I mean, the big reason I play on those 17mm or 0.67 diameters is so that I can get, a big low register sound. I can really use my chops down there, and I just didn't feel like I was getting that out of the Monette. I think above all, it goes back to that flat rim. There are several things that a flat rim does to me that are undesirable in the end. First of all, I mentioned that when your rim is flatter, you've got a sharper inner edge, and I could really feel my lips grazing against that, and that really fatigues me more so than the high point being a little bit further out on the rim. And speaking of the high point, I mentioned that it affects sort of how wide the mouthpiece feels even if the inner diameter is still kept the same. If you move the high point towards the outside of the rim, it feels roomier. And that's a big strength of the Bach 1.5C. Its high point is a little bit further out, and so I find it to be really roomy on the chops without necessarily being completely massive. Like, yes, a Bach 1C is quite a bit bigger than a 1.5C, but the 1.5C feels just large enough for me because of where that high point sits relative to the inner diameter. But not only did the rim not feel good on my face, it was tiring me out faster due to that inner edge. The inner diameter was not effectively quite as wide on my face because my lips were being clamped down for a larger portion, I guess, of their surface area, leaving less room essentially in the middle to vibrate, and that's what was causing low register issues. So basically, most of the things I didn't like stemmed towards that rim based on a New York Bach 3C. Now, if you've seen my other mouthpiece reviews, maybe you've noticed that this one was, rather than focusing on hard-hitting facts and certainties, a little bit more up in the air and me-centric. Oh, I liked this part, I didn't really like that part. I this, I that, what does that mean for you? Unfortunately, that's beyond the scope of this video, and the reason for that is that Monette mouthpieces, more so than most other brands, require testing, personalization, and acclimation, especially the third. This is a very long process, and it's worth embarking on if you know exactly what you're looking for, and you're able to get the right fit for you, and you're able to spend time only playing on that mouthpiece. Then you might well find revolutionary results, and you might never play a mouthpiece other than a Monette again with any success. That definitely has been the case for, peers and teachers of mine, but that's not where I'm at. I tried this thing out, I got decent results from it, and that's the thing, is trying out a random Monette is pretty unlikely to give you anything more than decent results. It's a similar sort of effect to what I described in my Lotus review not too long ago. You can find that up in the top right corner if you want. The general lowdown is, the B4S, well, I can't even remember the model name without looking at it. The B4SFL R6 is a pretty good cornet mouthpiece. it does the cornet thing, as you would expect from a $300 cornet mouthpiece. My personal thing is, if I got similar or better results out of a Yamaha 16E or a Dennis Wick 2B, I'm not even going to bother putting in the time to actually acclimate to that Monette, but I had no need to do so. I wasn't the one who had dropped $300 on it, so I was fine to just try it out and go, The Monette catalog is so diverse due to the amount of custom work that Dave Monette does, that talking about one specific B4SFL cup is not really going to do much for you if you are actually looking for a Monette cornet mouthpiece. You really should go to Dave and talk to him about what it is that you're looking for and see what all he can machine for you and what effects that has on your playing. This, again, like I said, was just a playtime experiment. Here's a cool mouthpiece, let's try it out, let's see what happens. Oh, it behaves similarly to other mouthpieces I've played that are similar in size. Well, shocker. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed this video. I didn't want to scrap this footage because, again, it's my first time demoing a Monette on the channel, and, you know, it deserves to see the light of day, even if it was from 2.5 years ago. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Until next time, once again, you can find more mouthpiece spotlights in the playlist up in the top right corner. I appreciate you sticking around, and we'll see you on the flip side. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support the creation of bigger and better content on the Samuel Plays Brass channel, have your name featured right here, and a whole host of other perks and benefits, then please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. For now, you can find more videos in the end screen cards to my left.